out to Judge Stein, who will be getting us started.
Good afternoon. Thank you all for being here. I want to welcome you to a special presentation by Government Law Center, Government Lawyer in Residence Bennett Liebman, in celebration of the 30th anniversary of the Warren M. Anderson series. I also convey a welcome from Dean Alicia Willette, who is attending to other very important duties, specifically teaching the class to our students at this moment. However, she does plan to join us at the reception being held in the East Foyer at the conclusion of the program, and I hope you all will join us at that as well. The Warren M. Anderson series, presented by the Government Law Center monthly each year during the legislative session from February to May. The series features experts who address major legal and policy issues pending before the New York State government. Please see our newly revised and updated website for a listing of and link to many of the programs that we have held as part of this series. Warren M. Anderson was a distinguished alumnus of the Albany Law School class of 1940. He served in the New York State Senate for 36 years, working with 6 governors. He was the longest serving majority leader of the Senate, holding that position from 1973 to 1988. This afternoon, as I said, we offer a very special presentation by Bennett Liebman, and to introduce Bennett, we are privileged to have our distinguished professor of law, Patrick Connor, to whom I will now turn this over.
Thank you very much, Judge Stein. We're also happy to be here today to hear Bennett talk. And I just came to the law school at the start of this century. And I can remember, I made a very important choice to live in Saratoga and commute down here, because I said, when I get up in the morning in August, I get out of bed, I want 2 feet to be within the city of Saratoga Springs. And during that time, I started to see one of my colleagues being referenced all over the place. I was reading books about horse racing. Bennett is cited in those books. I'm watching television. Bennett is being talked about. He's not a guest. They're talking about something Bennett said. I'm at the paddock in Belmont Park in 2004 with 115,000 people crowded together. There's Bennett in the paddock area with Bill Murray and a failed Triple Crown by Smarty Jones. Podcasts, we came into podcasts later on, and I'm hearing Bennett not only on national podcasts, but being talked about on national podcasts. Why? Because Bennett is thoughtful, his writing is uncluttered, it's well researched, it's not biased. And remember the ad, right? When E.F. Hutton talks, people listen. That's Bennett Liebman in so many areas. And it's not limited to horse racing or racing and wagering, gambling. He's written a great piece on the origins of the term Triple Crown. Where did that come from? I'm looking here at an article he wrote in 2018, The Quest for Black Voting Rights in New York State, which has been cited in several places. Bennett Liebman has been cited in Corbett on contracts, which is really amazing. There's a lot of talk in academia about scholarship. We don't have to look any further for fantastic scholarship that has an influence in the public domain than your writing. And I don't know if you know this, Bennett, but I was at a talk one time, and I think you were in the audience, and I made a comment about Secretariat starting slowly from the gate. That was on a Friday. Friday or Tuesday rolls around, and I get something in the mail. And here it is, Secretariat's past performance. It's packed. Secretary's record. He didn't always break late, although he wrote slowly as a 2-year-old, Bennett. And that's Bennett, backing up what he has to say. And my mom always said I should carry a religious artifact around with me at all times. And I have this taped up on my office door. We're really in for a treat today, and I welcome my fantastic colleague, Bennett Liebman.
honestly, I'm not sure what to say after that, since I felt that my major accomplishment in 30 years of state government was getting a Brooklyn driver license. So I'm really thankful, Pat, Judge Stein. I was hoping for some lobby talks before I gave my silly speech, but Pat, you need a new set of friends. So some forewarning before I get started. This is a fairly personal speech, so it's obviously not, I'm obviously not speaking for the Government Law Center or for the law school. I'm also not used to speaking in this beautiful room. I've been on a moderator of a number of panels here, but far more likely I'm outside with Lisa, our fantastic Lisa Rivich, registering people for CLE. This isn't, because I know you're all worried about a PowerPoint presentation. This really isn't it. Just a number of slides. You can all relax, stop cursing under your breath, because it's not going to be another pointless PowerPoint presentation. So you can all relax, and about midway through the speech, I'll wake you up with the CLE code. So for that, let me thank everybody for coming here, being on Zoom as well, and letting me speak to you this afternoon. It's an amazing honor, and I'm extremely grateful to Judge Stein, Patrick Woods, our whole staff at the Government Law Center, and our advisory board, led by PJ Costello, for arranging for me to speak. I think I've held every position at the Government Law Center over the past 2 decades. I've been the coordinator for racing and wagering law, the acting director, the executive director, and on 2 occasions, the interim director. I've worked for wonderful, brilliant bosses in Ray Brescia and Ava Harris. But all my work over 2 decades at this school has just been a minute fraction of the work that Patty Salkin did here in any given month. Patty originated the Anderson program, and it's her legacy that, notwithstanding my appearance here today, has made it what I think it is, the premier public policy forum in the Capitol. Now, almost from the start, 2 of the major topics handled at the Anderson series have been ethics and gambling. It's not surprising. They've been overarching topics that have gone hand in hand ever since colonial reform. What I'm trying to do here today is give you basically a 3-part view of what's happened here. History of New York gambling, history of New York gambling corruption, and a comparison to overall corruption scandals within New York State. These are long issues that I've been involved in, and I've been involved in this for a long time. I started with the state in 1975, at the height of the post-Watergate era, where young attorneys, perhaps having seen too much idealistic TV shows of that era, came into government thinking that they would make government work. On top of that, I found myself working in Manhattan at the office of the first Board of Public Disclosure established by Governor McCary. To show you how long I've been involved in this issue, that board very early on established what we jokingly call the Seymour Katz Rule. The board authorized Seymour Katz, who was a high-ranking official in the former Department of Social Services, to teach a course at SUNY Albany. It became the Seymour Katz Rule, and all requests were limited outside adjunct teaching, largely to this day, that followed the Seymour Katz Rule. Years later, I moved to Albany, and my wife's family lived across the street from Seymour Katz. I became friends with Seymour's family. I went to his family's weddings, bat mitzvahs. I even went to his funeral. And Seymour's legacy continues. At his granddaughter, Freddie Goldstein, ended up being Bill de Blasio's press secretary. I also found myself working for Secretary of State Mario Cuomo. It's hard to imagine, but Mario Cuomo in 75 was both a little naive and even more idealistic. We were to treat everyone equally. No one was to get a break. It wasn't as wild or self-righteous as even more moralistic Charles Evans Hughes in 1906. Hughes, after he was elected governor, was asked by his friend Joe Hedges for a position on the Public Service Commission. Hedges had made use of nominees. Hedges later became the Republican candidate for governor. Hughes turned him down, saying, "I can't very well appoint you. You're my friend." And Mario enforced his morality in making sure we could do little wrong. No one was to do political work on state time. We had to file a report every time we spoke to a lobbyist. Nobody could give a speech without prior permission. And if he ever thought he did anything wrong, he would read you out. Nothing would ever hurt. If he thought he might be doing something questionable, he simply stopped talking to us. In 1976, he got the notion that we might be assigning inspection visits on out-of-state land subdivision sales as an excuse for vacations. He simply stopped talking to me about it. He was fascinated by the world of horse racing and gambling, but he thought it was silly. He grew up in Jamaica. His junior high school was less than 2 miles from both Aqueduct and Jamaica. His law partner and close friend, Peter Dwyer, was a die-hard racing fan. Dwyer and his pal, Freddie Flynn, would even drive to Harrington Racetrack, a small harness track in southern Delaware, because it was the only track in the East that was open between Christmas and New Year's. Dwyer would barge into the office and say, "My ex-partner is the Secretary of State, and I'm the only lawyer in Brooklyn who doesn't have a pass to the track." Mario was fascinated by gambling. He just didn't get why anyone would waste money. For my part, I've always been interested in games. My parents lived 3 blocks from Aqueduct before I was born. You could see the old Roosevelt Raceway from my high school, and I landed up in a dorm room with guys who took out student loans so they could bet at Saratoga homes. I hated horse. Shouldn't say that here, but I hated it so much that I would regularly take a subway and a bus to get to the Yonkers Raceway. My friends and I even tried to publish a harness racing tip sheet. So when there was a vacancy in the tin racing wagering board in the late 1980s, I asked Governor Mario Cuomo to be appointed. He gave in, but only after telling me I was wasting my time and my law degree. At the racing board, I discovered that a side commissioner was not expected to do much of anything but show up. So I tried to learn about racing and gambling, and I'm still learning. No. So from my learning, I'm sorry, I can divide New York gambling history into 3 distinct eras. We lived through the age of lottery until 1850, then 100 years plus of horse racing dominance, and now we're back in the lottery universe. Also underscoring this history is that according to gambling maven William Thompson, historically and in contemporary times, New York has also led the nation in illegal gambling activities. We had illegal gambling casinos thriving in Saratoga Springs from 1850 through 1950. There were hundreds, if not thousands, of illegal gambling establishments in New York City in the 1800s, including an estimated 6,000 gaming establishments in 1850. In colonial New York, the lottery was a regular feature of life. These were mainly private lotteries. They were run by individuals without the imprimatur of state government. They were everywhere. The colonial legislature regularly passed laws to discourage the spread of these private lotteries. In a 1747 law, the legislature stated that private lotteries brought, quote, pernicious consequences to the public by encouraging numbers of laboring people to assemble together at taverns where such lotteries are usually set on foot and drawn. Sounds like Buffalo Wild Wings to me, but eventually private lotteries were banned. But there were numerous times when the colonial legislature authorized public lotteries, starting in 1746. And even after 1821, where lotteries were banned in the state constitution, they continued for nearly 2 decades. The first public lottery authorized fortifications for the city of New York. Without listing all the colonial lotteries, the fortification lottery was followed by lotteries for City Hall in New York, a New York City jail, assistance for the city of Albany, the Sandy Hook Lighthouse in New Jersey, and even a lottery to encourage the growing of hemp. After independence, the public lotteries continued. There was a lottery to settle New York City's debt, to rebuild the Ulster County Courthouse, to improve navigation on the Hudson, to improve the port of Sag Harbor, to promote literature, to build the State House in Albany, and a number of lotteries to help out colleges. Getting a lottery became the 19th century equivalent of a member item. The chief beneficiary of these college lotteries was Union College under its president, Eliphalet Knott. And in Schenectady, that's the Knott Memorial, Knott Terrace, Knott Street. He was the president of Union for 62 years. He served simultaneously as the first president of RPI. For 11 years, between 1820 and 1849, Union graduated more students than any other college. Knott started at Union in 1804, and by 1805, he had secured a $80,000 lottery for Union College. This was just the start of Knott's relationship with the lottery. Francis Wayland, the longtime president of Brown University, wrote, "No man ever exerted so great an influence on the legislation of New York." You had Giorgio De Rosa, Jim Featherstone Hall, and Pat Brown all wrapped up in one college president. You wouldn't need a council on independent colleges if you just had Eliphalet Knott. Knott struck again in 1814. He needed land for a new campus. He returned to the legislature with far more grandiose plans. He wanted $200,000 for Union College. And this was in the middle of the War of 1812, where a significant part of the war was being fought in upstate New York. Obviously, this was not an easy lift, but Knott did his thing. He log rolled his bill through the legislature. He brought on newly formed Hamilton College, which would receive $40,000. $30,000 in allocated funds would go to the endowment of the College of Physicians and Surgeons. The Asbury African Church was to receive $4,000. There was a lottery for the New York Historical Society. That only left Columbia, New York's first college. Something had to be done to placate Columbia. So Knott arranged for some minor lands in Manhattan to be transferred from the state to Columbia. The lands constituted the Hoosac botanical gardens, a 20-acre property far away from the center of New York City. Columbia wasn't happy, but it couldn't stop not. 171 years later, Columbia President Michael Sovereign said that the land had been fobbed off on Columbia in 1814. Knott's accomplishments were so extraordinary that the official session laws for the 1814 session read, no bill before the legislature excited greater interest and attention of this act than this act. Much credit is due to the unwearied exertions of the able and eloquent president of Union College in procuring its passage. In 1821, the New York Constitution banned lotteries, but the controversies involving the Union College lottery continued for decades. Since the state no longer wanted to be involved with managing the lotteries, Knott personally became the manager of the lottery. He also bought out the potential shares of lottery revenues from Hamilton College, the College of Physicians and Surgeons, the Asbury African Church, and the New York Historical Society. The lottery was simply to benefit Union College. The headquarters of the New York Lottery, as it is today, were in Schenectady. The kicker to this story is that while Union benefited significantly from the lottery, the real winner in the lottery saga was Columbia. For the worthless plot it had been given in 1814 turned out to be Rockefeller Center. For a century, proceeds from the property helped to strengthen Columbia's endowment and maintain its finances during the Depression. Columbia eventually sold the property for $500 million in 1985. The joke was on Union. With the end of the lotteries, New York moved on to horse racing, and it truly dominated gambling for more than a century. Why did New York become known as the Big Apple? Because it was the #1 destination for the top horses in America, starting with Saratoga in 1863 and Jerome Park in the Bronx in 1866. New York dominated American racing. For decades, the biggest race in America was the Futurity, the two-year-olds run at Sheepshead Bay in Brooklyn. It was all New York. Sure, there were hiccups along the way. In 1894, the state constitution ended all gambling, thereby seeming to end the possibility of horse racing. The state legislature connived a way around the Constitution, and the courts somehow upheld the legislature's actions. Racing continued and prospered. Governor Charles Evan Hughes persuaded the legislature to ban horse racing based on his belief that it violated the state constitution. But after a 2.5-year moratorium, courts allowed racing back, finding somehow that oral betting without a written record, did not constitute bookmaking. Racing survived in New York under oral betting. It started to prosper during the Depression, and when pari-mutuels were legalized in 1940, the sport in New York went through the roof. Nighttime harness racing with a mobile starting gate became a huge hit. By the early 1950s, thoroughbred racing had the highest attendance of any sport in the nation, and harness racing was the nation's major growth sport. The New York Racing Association took over the New York thoroughbred tracks and rebuilt Aqueduct in Belmont and improved Saratoga. In 1964, Aqueduct averaged more than 30,000 fans a day, and there were 25,000 fans nightly at both New York's downstate harness tracks, Yonkers and Roosevelt. The state pari-mutuel tax in 1964, when you factor in inflation, brought in far more money than all the state's VLTs currently produce, and also far more than what mobile sports wagering will produce this year. By the late 1960s, harness racing even surpassed thoroughbred racing, even in handle. It was great while it lasted, but this began to change in the 70s with OTB coming in, harness racing scandals, increased suburbanization, and more gambling opportunities through the lottery in Atlantic City. And since the 1980s, the lottery has taken over. New York gambling with jackpot games, numbers, scratch offs, and the video lottery. That's really the reality is that lottery simply embodies New York gambling. So in 2018, my estimate was that gambling revenue in New York was 7.1 billion, of which 73.5% of the revenue was from the lottery. Yes, well,
Here we are. One moment, please. Apologies.
that was 44.6% from traditional lottery, with numbers, jackpot, lotto games, quick draw, and scratch offs, and 28.8% from video lottery terminals. The lottery accounted for 5.3 billion in revenue. The casinos accounted for 21.5% of the revenue, with about 2/3 of this revenue coming from tribal casinos. You might be wondering about the diminution of racing. Has it really reached such a low stage where it only accounts for 4% of gambling revenue? The answer, unfortunately, is yes. When you compare 1969 to 2019 and adjust for the cost of living, horse racing handle is 15.2% of what it was in 1969. And that's including the handle from out-of-state account wagering hubs. In 1969, there were no OTBs, no exotic bets, no bets on out-of-state races, and no televised racing, and no account wagering. We went from betting 9 races a day physically at the track to betting on an unlimited number of races from everywhere, which you can bet on at any time from any device. And we're at 15% of where we were in 1969. Also, you'll see a minuscule number for fantasy sports. That's just the reality. Fantasy sports really have become just a gateway drug for real sports wagering. I know these figures are from 2018 and they don't account for mobile sports wagering. I would estimate that gross gaming revenue from sports wagering will be about 1.4 billion. That means about 15% of the gross gambling win in New York will come from sports wagering. It's still a fraction of lottery revenue. We don't talk about a lot, but the lottery really is the face of New York gambling. So it's good to give you a history of New York gambling. The problem is that New York gambling comes with a supersized side of corruption. It's what Starbucks might call the venti size of venality. It starts with the old lottery. Every manner of chicanery took place. They were run by private managers who took their cut of the fees. The tickets were sold in private establishments, and they took their share of the money. Swindles were everywhere. People would sell tickets and then not have a drawing. Counterfeit tickets would be sold. Tickets would be sold for non-existent lotteries. Lottery proprietors would skip town before paying up. It was often fractional ownership of lottery tickets. 2 centuries before the producers, you had sellers selling more than 100% of the lottery ticket. An assembly committee in 1819 noted that nothing could divest the lottery of all the evils which has hitherto proved so baneful a cause. Much of this was exemplified by the career our old friend, a lift not. Having made himself the manager of the Union College Lottery, Knott arranged to receive 2.25% of sales to be placed in his president's fund. His percentage later increased to 6.31% of sales. Years of litigation and legislative inquiries followed the Union College Lottery and Knott's personal use of the lottery funds. An assembly report in 1850 found that President Knott did use the funds of said college as his own interchangeably as occasions did arise. An initial state Senate 1852 report found that Knott had taken $885,000 of the college's fund for himself. This was followed by a final state Senate inquiry, which was designed to resolve the whole matter. The 1854 report exonerated Knott, but largely because in the interim between 1852 and 1854, Knott gave back $600,000 to the college, plus the lands he had bought with his proceeds, which actually turned out to be most of what is currently Long Island City in Queens. This apparently convinced the Senate that Knott had somehow, even though it's 40 years after the lottery started, always intended to give all the lottery proceeds to Union College. Subsequent histories of the college indicate otherwise. Knott's own lawyer told him, "Sir, you do not have a shadow of right to that property. Your title to it is not worth a straw." Knott was what the early lotteries were about. Almost total greed. I wish the horse racing era was as pure as the early lottery, but I'm not sure that's the case. Here's a look at some of the public corruption issues that have arisen in horse racing. And this is simply public officials and public funds. It doesn't get into corruption by racetrack operators. It's a long list. Some of the listings will speak for themselves. Others need explanation. In the first examples, the forces trying to keep Governor Hughes from ending racing in 1908 did their best to persuade with money legislators from voting with Hughes. There's one case here where they tried to kidnap an anti-racing legislator from getting to the Capitol to vote on racing bills. Herbert Bayard Swope was nearly a great man. He won the first Pulitzer Prize as a reporter. He was the editor of the New York World when it was America's most significant paper. He inaugurated the op-ed. He likely coined the term Cold War. He was also the chair of the State Racing Commission, and he used that position to do whatever he liked, which included being the chairman of a major racetrack in a different state. He was a great man who believed that petty conflicts simply applied to others. The next series of corruption deals with the belief that obtaining a racing license was the equivalent of printing money. After legalizing pari-mutuels in 1940, the legislature went on a display of bipartisanship at its absolute worst. You might envision an episode of the Oprah show where Oprah says, "You get a harness track, you get a harness track." And that's what largely happened in the state capitol. The legislators and the political leaders got the licenses. Democratic Senate Minority Leader Jimmy Dunnigan, who billed himself as the father of pari-mutuels, opened up Buffalo Raceway. Irwin Steingart, the Democratic Assembly Minority Leader from Brooklyn, had the majority share in Batavia Downs. Holding much of the minority share in Batavia was former Republican Assemblyman and Assistant Secretary to the Senate, Pat Provenzano, and the Provenzano heirs ran the racetrack until 1994. Vernon Downs was incorporated by a number of Republican leaders, including the then current and former Republican Party chairs and State Senate Majority Leader Arthur Wicks. They sold most of their stock to lower level Republican leaders, and George Fearon, former Republican State Senate Majority Leader, became the chairman of Vernon. Saratoga Harness was run by Republican Party activists who were originally from Albany County. The two downstate tracks, Roosevelt and Yonkers, were an overall amalgamated mess. They featured an assortment of Republican county leaders, Tammany Hall, mob-related officials, Norman Penny, who was the Republican Assembly who sponsored the pari-mutuel bill, and a number of labor racketeers. The cleanup of this overall mess led to the passage of the state's first major ethics legislation, including the provisions that in current sections 73 and 74 of the Public Offices Law. So you state employees can thank harness racing for the state code of ethics. Also, the guy brought in to clean up harness racing, George Monahan, lost his job after taking numerous free meals from Yonkers Raceway. Then we had a series of problems largely dealing with former Congressman Eugene Keogh, who had become a member of the State Racing and Wagering Board. The Keogh plan is named for him. He had a financial arrangement with Yonkers, and he ordered the board staff to license George Steinbrenner. After he was forced off the board in 1976, the new board leadership compounded the problem by firing the staff people who had complained about Keogh. People still believe that a racing license was the way to millions. So you see Brooklyn Democratic Party boss Meade Esposito trying to get an ownership interest in quarter horse tracks. He failed, and Attorney General Abrams had him removed from his party chairmanship. One never built track was in Albany County. The built one was in Suffolk County, and the Suffolk County track was an absolute mess and flopped not once, but twice. And since then, we've seen individual acts of corruption at the OTBs. Some of the leaders of Western OTB were forced to resign. Davis Etkin, the longtime head of Capital OTB, pled guilty to felonies. Hazel Dukes and Bill Carnevale, who ran New York City OTB, were found guilty of crimes. Walter Conlon at Suffolk OTB was forced to resign for contracting violations. And just recently, the Gaming Inspector General found that Catskill OTB's finances and their offices were absolute total messes. And the fact is, this is just the public corruption side. Between 1995 and 2005, Vernon Downs was run by a series of corrupt individuals, which forced the racing board to twice place independent monitors in charge of the track. Jamaica Racetrack in Queens was a Tammany Hall outpost. Saratoga in the 19th century was owned by a series of major gamblers. There were serious allegations that Roosevelt Raceway was financially drained by its parent corporation, Gulf and Western. NYRA staff was regularly accused of demanding kickbacks for stall space. NYRA under Kenny No in the 1990s was found by the controller and the attorney general to have improperly bid major contracts. Several employees at NYRA were found guilty of tax fraud. NYRA itself was indicted by the federal government for tax fraud in 2003. But here's a somewhat brighter side to it. In the age of the lottery, we've seen far fewer corruption issues. On the operations side, I don't recall improper lottery payments, whether it's been on jackpots, daily numbers scratch off, or video lotteries. Even the non-operational side has been quiet. In 1975, the lottery held drawings for which no winning tickets had been drawn and did not properly inform the public. In 1979, the lottery gave the contract to run Lotto to a Rupert Murdoch-controlled corporation, not long after the New York Post had endorsed Hugh Carey for re-election. This proved to be a very short-lasting story. The one major lottery issue was the crookedness of the Aqueduct Entertainment Group, which somehow nearly won the contract to operate BLTs at Aqueduct in 2009. And the application, the group, they were beset with leaks of confidential information, favored companies, pay to play, potential bid review. They did everything wrong, and they almost got the Racino contract at Aqueduct. Again, I've mentioned before, we've had a undercurrent of illegal casino gambling, and this casino gambling has always been accompanied by public corruption. In New York City in the 1890s, the police basically demanded protection money to let the gamblers stay in business. It was undoubtedly worse in Saratoga Springs from 1920 through 1950, when gangsters ran a large number of fancy casinos. The law enforcement officials in the city of Saratoga and the county of Saratoga were regularly bribed. The Albany leadership looked the other way. Occasionally, a governor might remove a public official or demand an investigation, but after these removals, Saratoga Springs went back to business as usual. Governors left Saratoga Springs alone. No aspect of gambling has been without a corruption aspect. Bingo was legalized in the mid-1950s and was such a big moneymaker that in many areas of the state, the mob took control of the bingo business. Governor Rockefeller named the Moreland Act Commission to stop bingo corruption. The State Investigations Commission similarly did its own report on the nexus between bingo and public corruption. Where there is gambling and the lure of both big money and easy money, you'll find corruption. Maybe that's why we see less of this currently in horse racing and the lottery today. They're not where the money is. We can expect more issues where big and easy money are possibilities, like the areas of sports gambling, casino gambling, and internet gambling. I interrupt this presentation to provide you with the CLE code. It's harness, HARNESS. Again, harness. If you want your credit, it's there. Hey, everybody get it? Harness, harness. No one bets it, but it's important today. This is really the last significant slide. So again, don't worry about PowerPoints. It's not happening. I wanted to see how gambling corruption compared with overall corruption scandals. Here's my chronological and subjective list of New York's top corruption scandals. I think it's helpful to view these scandals by looking at who the source of the venality is. Who's corrupting whom? Who started it? Is it coming from outside the government or from inside the government? The traditional way is that people outside the government bribe the decision makers in the government. That's what happened in the original 19th century banking scandal. You needed the legislature to get you a banking franchise. Everyone that wanted a banking franchise bribed the legislature. It got so bad that in 1812, Governor Daniel Tompkins, who had the power back then, sent the legislature back home in the face of notorious bribery efforts. It didn't matter. The legislature returned a month later and chartered the bribing bank. Maybe the most notorious efforts at outside instigation was the railroad wars in the 1860s. The Erie Railroad, represented by Jay Gould and Jim Fisk, and the New York Central, owned by Cornelius Vanderbilt, took turns buying the legislature. The gas company and life insurance company scandals in 1905 followed the same pattern. The companies were in the habit of paying off the legislature. One life insurance company even had a house about a half mile from here at 616 Madison Avenue, which functions as an entertainment home for legislators. The newspapers called it the House of Mirth. The other outside in scandals included the SLA bribery cases, the streetcar bribery activities in the 1880s, and the 1970s nursing homes. The other method of corruption is where the insiders, the legislature or the executive, start the corruption process. If there's a prototype of this brand of corruption, it's probably the administration of Syracuse Mayor Lee Alexander in the 1970s and 1980s. Alexander simply put the Syracuse city up for grabs. If you wanted anything from the city, you paid Alexander. He took kickbacks on most every deal that possibly involved the city of Syracuse. There were at least 1.2 million in bribes and kickbacks. The 1850s 40 Thieves scandal involved the New York Common Council. They truly earned their nickname by selling off major parts of city property, awarding ferry leases and railroad franchises simply in return for kickbacks. The Tweed Ring, which held sway in New York City and New York State in the late 1860s, did the 40 Thieves crowd by expanding on their legacy. Besides the crimes of the 40 Thieves, they awarded contracts to themselves. They bought up land cheaply and then built roads, sewers, water pipes, and public works projects on that land, which greatly increased the value of that property. The New York County Courthouse, known today as the Tweed Courthouse, was supposed to cost $1 million. It cost more than $11 million, with much of the extra cost due to payments to the Tweed Ring. Tweed himself even bought a marble quarry to supply marble to the project. No fraudulent stone was left unturned. The canal issues and the Jimmy Walker scandals also followed the same blueprint. So did the New York City parking violation scandals, where public officials and party leaders solicited bribes from various private companies engaged in the parking ticket business. What kind of kickbacks can we get from selling off our assets and our franchises? Another type of insider scandal comes from police agencies demanding protection. That's what happened with the Lexow Committee report in New York Police in the 1890s and the Knapp Commission in the 1970s. We also have insiders using their positions to try to get better jobs and positions for themselves. That's the case of harness racing in the 50s. Finally, you'll see the Black Horse Cavalry. That was another twist on the insider created corruption scandals. Individual legislators introduced or threatened to introduce bills that harm corporations. Maybe it would be a bill to increase taxes on a specific taxpayer. Maybe it would be a bill to revoke or limit a corporation's franchise. In any event, the purpose of legislation was not to better government, to force the corporation to pay a bribe to prevent the harmful legislation from moving ahead. Theodore Roosevelt, who was in the assembly in the 1880s, estimated that there were a great many thoroughly corrupt men in the legislature, perhaps a third of the whole number. Gradually, this Black Horse Cavalry practice moved to the leadership of the two parties, and Tammany Hall and Republican boss Tom Platt employed this Black Horse Cavalry for themselves. You can argue that this technique was used in the most recent series of legislative scandals. If you wanted your continued benefits, you had to include the Speaker or the Senate majority leaders. But actually, the recent prosecutions of legislators have to be evaluated on an individual basis. Some were broad, like Carl Kruger. Pedro Espada was more like the harness racing situation. He founded a nonprofit health network and used it like a piggy bank. Then you have former Assemblyman William Boylan, who combined it all. He solicited bribes, falsely claimed state travel expenses, and used a grant he had steered to a nonprofit for his own political campaign. So when you look at the list of these major scandals and compare it to our gambling corruption issues, you find that most of the major scandals have not involved gambling. Gambling was a significant part of the Lexow investigation and the Knapp Commission investigation. Gambling was the centerpiece of the harness racing scandal and also the United States Senate Kefauver hearings in 1950, which found a total lack of law enforcement to combat casino gambling in Saratoga Springs, as well as major ties between gamblers and political officials. The Kefauver revelations ended casinos in Saratoga Springs and ended the political career of New York City Mayor Bill O'Dwyer, who resigned to become U.S. ambassador to Mexico. But while corruption might have followed gambling, most of the major corruption scandals in New York did not have a gambling component. Gambling may be associated with corruption, but corruption in New York has not needed gambling to proceed. Gambling is a sufficient, but not a necessary part of New York corruption. The question becomes, and as Boss Tweed supposedly said, what are you going to do about it? And I'm not the same moralist that I might have been in 1975. Since I've retired 8 years ago, I found out how political and extra legal forces saved many of my relatives in the World War II era. Political intervention allowed my cousins to escape from Nazi Germany in the spring of 1939. On the other side of my family, my aunt and my cousin got out of Russia in 1938 after another political intervention. My aunt's husband, who had been imprisoned in Stalinist Russia, escaped to China, where he was reunited with his Korean family. They survived through extra legal assistance. I'm very aware of Jesus' admonition, judge not, lest ye be judged. But the facts are overwhelming. I know that major reform action is necessary. The fact is, sometimes you have to judge. Let's start with what hasn't worked. My starting premise is that the history of reforming New York government has not worked. We get a reform wave to stop a Jimmy Walker or a Boss Tweed, and a few years later, that zeal for reform is past. We slip back to our old ways. Until we can have an electorate that remains focused on reforms, our efforts will never be sufficient. We have, in theory, a system where the state's 62 DAs could prosecute official corruption. They have the jurisdiction, but it hasn't worked. They have largely passed. Over the 21st century, the prosecution of legislators has largely fallen to the U.S. attorneys. We've federalized official corruption in New York. We've largely let Crete do it. The current state system hasn't worked. Second, the 21st century ethics commissions haven't worked. You obviously need an independent commission, qualified members, a fair voting system, better coverage of the legislature, and clear rules on what is or isn't confidential. But ethics commissions in New York and in other states really aren't prosecutorial agencies. They exist primarily for advice, for training, and for providing public information. You'd have to hire a ton of officers, of investigators, prosecutors, and hearing officers, and change the entire nature of ethics commissions. Until you change the ethics commission into a prosecutorial system, basically an inspector general with quasi-judicial powers, you're not going to make a major impact on corruption. Finally, audits by state controllers, and it's not just on the current controller, it's been that way since I entered state government. They're okay, but little comes of it. You know, state controller says one thing, the subjects of the audit say the opposite. Nothing happens. It's always Groundhog Day on these investigations. In the field of racing, we get audits really regarding NYRA where it's always he said, she said. The controller says that NYRA violated competitive bidding requirements, and NYRA claims it did. Very little gets accomplished, and it's become a soporific enterprise. Meanwhile, much of the racing media has been complaining about New York's drug testing regimen, and you can hardly find an audit that deals with the SUNY Morrisville drug claim. What might work in gambling? One, To the extent that it's constitutional, we ought to ban political contributions from gambling companies and their representatives. It works in New Jersey. It lessens pressures on regulators. It even lessens the pressure on the gaming industry to enter pay-to-play arrangements. We don't want the downstate casino bidders providing funds to the legislature or to the executive. It's not a panacea. In the casino competition area, you'll see the hotel workers union deeply involved in the political game. The fact is, gambling's not a proper area for political contributions. Two, the Gaming Inspector General has now been folded into the broader Inspector General's office. We need this position to be fully funded, and it needs a broader focus, not just internally on public employees, but on all aspects of the private gaming industries in New York. Three, the existing OTB system should end. Only Capital OTB has any interest in conducting wagering on horse racing. Suffolk OTB is totally dependent on its VLT facility. Western OTB is dependent on its racino at Batavia Downs. Nassau OTB gets a significant share of revenue from Genting's Aqueducts Racino. Catskill OTB handled $15 million in all of 2020. That's not even a good day at Saratoga. You either end the system totally and let NYRA and the out-of-state wagering systems handle it, or consolidate OTB in one system. Four, we need to figure out what parts of NYRA's operations are subject to public availability. We went from a system where most everything was available to one where little is available. Why not have accurate numbers on real turnstile attendance at Saratoga? Why are the major reports of NYRA from its outside monitors more than a decade ago still not available? On the general corruption side, I have a few ideas as well. The state inspector general must be independent of gubernatorial control. We need a state level office to prosecute official corruption. There is no place to put that other than in the attorney general's office. If the individual DAs aren't doing it, someone else has to do that. Now, those of us who started state government in the 1970s tend to worry about this because of what we would call the Maurice Najari factor. He was special prosecutor for New York City court system, and he largely terrorized the court system and ran amok. In placing the power in an individual in the AG's office, we can put some political constraints on it. Three, we need to revise Section 107 of the Civil Service Law. This is the so-called State Little Hatch Act, which tries to prevent political interference in government. It's an anachronism. Much of it dates from the 1880s, and it's unfit for our electronic age. Four, we're not going to have a full-time legislature, but the leaders of the legislature ought to be full-time and be prevented from having outside paying positions. Five, the executive and the legislature need to be more proactive in ending corruption. The governor has extensive removal powers, which haven't been utilized since the 1930s. The legislature, through investigative committees, ended the police scandals in New York in the 1990s, the gas and life insurance scandals in 1905, and the Tammany Jiminy Walker hijinks in the 1920s. But these legislative investigative commissions have totally faded from sight. Six, we should not ever have member items. The quid pro quo possibilities are just overwhelming. And finally, hopefully it doesn't come down to this. The 2021 showed us that our laws governing impeachment are totally antiquated. But all these institutional reforms are not enough. Our overall problem has been our massive indifference to corruption. If it doesn't affect our daily lives, we look the other way. We have to be proactive. If you see something, say something. But our history has been that we actively avoid seeing any kind of need. Look at the history I presented. In 1870, the Tweed Ring presented its municipal charter for vote in New York City. The federal government, knowing Tweed's tactics, prevented new immigrants from voting and even sent troops and warships to New York City to stop Tweed. The Tweed Charter easily passed. In 1871, during the height of the scandal, Tweed won re-election as a state senator. For 60 years, people in Albany kept electing the O'Connell-Corning organization, even though it was inherently corrupt. In 1938, when running for governor, Tom Dewey maintained there were more voters in Albany than there were adult residents in the city. But as so long as O'Connell kept his own Hendrick's beer on tap and kept property taxes down on Democrats, they kept voting for him. When Howard Samuels became the first president of New York City OTB, his staff was clearly and intentionally assembled not to run a gambling operation, but to run his 1974 campaign for governor. Nobody batted an eye. For nearly 30 years, Davis Etkin at Capital OTB treated the corporation as his personal fiefdom. But he was disarming and the Energizer Bunny of horse racing. He brought world-class tennis to Schenectady. People may have thought he was the second coming of Eliphalet Knott. For decades, his corporation performed worse than any other OTB, but nobody close to his corporation ever opposed his reign. In 1997, Donald Trump stopped Governor Pataki's constitutional casino resolution through employing $1 million worth of lobbyists and donating $100,000 to the New York Senate Democrats. The Senate Democrats then proceeded to vote 23-3 to kill casinos. It was a one-day story. But the worst situation was in Saratoga Springs. Let's start with the adoration of John Morrissey, who started the track and its main casino in the 1860s. Basically a thief and probably a murderer. Then from 1920s to 1950s, the worst elements of the mob ran the Saratoga casinos. There was Lucky Luciano, Arnold Rothstein, Meyer Lansky, and Frank Costello. Yet the people of Saratoga Springs elected Democratic bagman Doc Leonard as their public safety commissioner on 13 separate occasions. When the heat got too hot, Doc would resign, which he did on only 3 occasions. And the supposed great governors of New York, Al Smith, FDR, Herbert Lehman, Tom Dewey, they basically did nothing. They put their heads in the sand, or maybe Saratoga Lake. They kept Saratoga open for the mob. Al Smith, after he was governor, even dined the Brook Club for Doc Leonard. The Brook Club was Arnold Rothstein's place. Smith was in the process of running for president. What in the world was he thinking? You can't think of the record of these governors and not feel ashamed. They abetted some of the worst mobsters in the nation's history. It's like a reboot of the film Chinatown, where the last line is, "Forget it, Franklin, it's Saratoga." If we are serious about corruption, we have to stop our indifference. Our indifference provides fertile soil for public corruption. Government is not a game. Maybe Eliphalet Knott would have disagreed, but I'm fairly confident Seymour Katz would have agreed. And hopefully I've convinced you to agree as well. You can't be silent. Our indifference only feeds corruption. Thank you. Anybody who was not, I've taken up so much time, people got to leave, right?
Great. Does anybody have questions for Mr. Liebman? We have a gentleman here.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. No, I'm not too late. Okay, go.
Within a month or so, the Supreme Court's going to hear argument in 2 of the Buffalo Billions predictions. And one cannot help but speculate that the only reason they took that case was to further cut back on the ability to prosecute public officials.
Maybe. I should probably, I would guess, and being cynical, that you're probably right.
Mr. Bowling.
Hi, I'm a first-year student here at Albany Law, and among people around my age, the mobile sports wagering is by far probably the most popular way of gambling. So, do you see like another wave of possible corruption upcoming with all the new ways that people are mobile sports wagering, how popular it's becoming?
I hope not. Again, the question is, what do we see in corruption, is possible corruption in mobile sports wagering? I hope not, but you're going to see a lot of activity in the clearly in the next legislative session on all the companies that do have operations are possibly going to try to lower the tax rate to and increase the possibility of wagers on other types of events, especially college events. And you know, again, when they've already thrown a lot of money around, and without insinuating that anyone's doing anything wrong, there is potential there.
We have one question from someone who's joining us remotely.
Hope it's my wife.
I don't think it is. How can we fight corruption when the gaming board won't adequately fund its gaming inspector positions?
It's not their position.
Okay.
It's not their position to fund. It's into the General Inspector General's office. And so if you're worried about that, talk to your legislature, talk to the governor.
Great.
Have I exhausted everybody? Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ben. Fabulous. And if you were afraid to ask your questions in public,
I will run. You start.
they join us downstairs in the East Foyer for a little recap.
Thank you all.